Welcome to the opening of a series of webinars of the IEEE Education Society. This is one of the basic pillars that the Society has planned this year to make known to all its members distinguished educational activities sponsored by the Society in different events and conferences. The basic point of information of all these activities is our website that you can see on the screen, and in particular in the education section. It presents the different current educational activities of the Society. IEEE Education Society has among its main strategic objectives the provision of new professional development opportunity for its members through the promotion, support and sharing of different educational activities. In particular, we have three actions. The traditional distinguished lecture programs, that is, the assistance or support for the participation of experts in events organized by chapters of our society. Merlot. Education Society endorses the participation of its members in Merlot Computer Science and Information System communities by producing and sharing open educational resources, OER. MOOC. Launch of the first MOOC of the Society on the topic of Foundation of OER in 2 editions in edX platform under the IEEE X channel. And finally, the launch of this series of webinars. The reason that has guided the launch of this program has been the improvement of the professional development of its members through the creation of a portfolio of quality educational resources. Our focus of attention is one of the most attractive and recognized products that we have. The outstanding workshop organizing conferences is sponsored by the Society. That is, Practice in Education Conference, EduCon Conference, Edu9 Conference, TAIL Conference. The quality of these resources is guaranteed because these workshops have passed the selection process of the organizers of the conference, and the success is accredited by the feedback provided by the attendees. We inaugurated this program with the participation of Jeff Freud. He is an editor-in-chief of the Transactions of Education Journal, and he has participated in the last year in conferences of the Society, successfully transmitting the publication criteria in this journal. He will organize, in fact, in the next month, this workshop in the EduCon Conference in the Canary Islands. Well-known of the education engineer, has obtained the recognition of IEEE and ASEE societies, elevating him to the category of fellow. Now, we had the opportunity to attend to a reduced version of his presentation in the workshops. Enjoy the webinar, and when you want, Jeff. Thanks.
So, thank you for joining me here today. I'm anxious to talk with you about publishing your scholarship in the IEEE transactions. I thank you for participating. If you have questions, I'd like for you to type them into the chat room rather than ask them through the audio, because it usually works better that way, and I have a chance to look at the question before I respond, and then we don't have to keep switching mics. Also, this is going to be recorded, and so you'll be able to access the recording after it's put up on the website. But in addition, if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, please email me at the address in the window, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of the presentation, because the focus of the presentation is on helping you publish your work in the IEEE transactions on education, or perhaps other venues on engineering education. For those people that just joined, if you could mute your mic, that would be helpful. And if you have a question, please pose it in the chat window, and I will look at those at the end of the presentation. So it is my intent to move through the presentation and highlight some things, and we'll see what questions we have time to deal with at the end. So there are two basic parts to the presentation. The first focuses on the three areas of scholarship that are published in the IEEE Transactions on Education. We'd like to go through the descriptions of those and then provide you some brief exercises that you can look to see how well the descriptions worked. And then we'll move on to the review criteria for the areas of scholarship to help with the last one, to help authors evaluate the degree to which their manuscript addresses the review criteria before it's submitted, so that they can get a reasonable shot at what the review criteria are and know how they would be evaluated before they submit the manuscript. Resources to help the authors with the review criteria have been published on this website. We continue to update it with new resources, and authors are encouraged to review these resources before submitting a manuscript so that they will have the best chance of having their manuscript accepted. So, what is the purpose of a journal? Well, for each individual author, a journal is a way to get their work known to others. But for the field, the purpose of the journal is to help advance the field, in this case, to advance the field of engineering education. But there's a question of what does that mean? What does it mean to advance the field of engineering education? There was a scholar who took this up about 15 years ago, and he set out a set of criteria. They're all listed here on the slide. The slide is pretty busy, so we'll go through those categories in individual things so you can see the categories. The first is what Fensham calls the structural categories. These deal with faculty appointments, journals, conferences, professional organizations. In these, engineering education does pretty well. There are professional organizations around the world for engineering education. There are conferences regularly held in attendance. There are several journals in which people can publish. And there are an increasing number of faculty appointments in the area of engineering education. So there we're doing pretty well. This is the area that the journals really have a focus on, and that's moving forward in the category of research. We should be looking for good research questions. We should be looking for models that can help explain what is going on in engineering education, the extent to which students are succeeding, the extent to which we have instructional approaches that help them learn. We should have research methodologies and assessment methodologies by which we assess student learning. And we should, over a period of 5 to 10 years, we should be seeing that we are progressing, that our studies are being cited by others, and that our methods are being used by others, and that we're influencing practice. In other words, practice is changing as practice adopts findings from the research field. So in those last two categories, the research category and the implications category or the outcome category, I think engineering education needs to make substantial progress. And through what we publish in the transactions, we're attempting to contribute to that progress. So where do we begin? So first, we want authors to know that the journal has a set of expectations that are articulated in the aims and scope. These are the aims and scope, even though, couple clarifications, even though it's an IEEE publication, we do not publish everything in the area of IEEE. We publish only in education. And in particular, we publish only in education in fields within the scope of interest of IEEE. That poses a problem. We see manuscripts that are submitted where people are making contributions to power electronics or control systems, and the Transactions on Education does not publish those contributions. it only publishes contributions to education in those fields. Second of all, if all of the contributions must be supported by evidence, and evidence must go beyond student self-report, that if we say students are learning, we need to do more than just ask students whether they are learning or whether they find a particular educational tool helpful. It needs to actually demonstrate that it has some influence on their learning, and that usually goes to faculty evaluated work or student work that is evaluated by external people. And so manuscripts that do not align with the aims and scope are returned to the authors without peer review. And so authors are encouraged to review the aims and scope before they're submitting to make sure that their contributions are aligned with the aims and scope. Next, we look at the areas of scholarship. There are 3 areas of scholarship, and the purpose of this is to help authors select the appropriate area of scholarship. The 3 areas of scholarship are discovery, integration, and application. Discovery takes our contributions that are in the form of new knowledge. They could be new assessment tools, they could be new explanations of student difficulty, they could be new explanations of where students are having trouble making progress in their educational fields. So these are the kind of standard things. So if you, in control systems, if you were making a contribution, you would have a new method for control system analysis, for example, or a new analysis of a category of control systems. Here in education, we are looking for new knowledge with respect to education. The next field is the scholarship of integration. These contributions are distinguished by synthesis across prior work. So we have a lot of prior work on contributions to education, for example, in electronics. And a scholarship of contribution would be to synthesize those contributions and identify patterns, themes, trends, opportunities, gaps, and so forth. Opportunities and gaps would be opportunities for new contributions. So the idea here is synthesis across prior research. The last field, this is where we get most of our manuscript submissions, are scholarships of application. These contributions describe how prior research to learning and teaching has been applied to design instructional activities or to design educational activities. These activities include courses, course segments, curricular laboratory experiments, capstone courses, and so forth. The work must demonstrate the application of published work and provide a cogently articulated rationale for the design decisions in the work. So those are the 3 areas. Again, they are discovery, integration, and application. So included in the PowerPoint presentation, there are some abstracts. And when I do this in a face-to-face mechanism, I have people read through the abstracts and then provide their guess at the appropriate area of scholarship. We're not going to take time for that today. However, I do want to leave the abstracts in the PowerPoint presentation. So if you take time to look at the PowerPoint presentation afterwards, you could look at each of the abstracts and put your idea about the appropriate area of scholarship. So that's what we do for each of these abstracts. The next thing I'd like to do is, assuming authors have selected the appropriate area of scholarship, either application, integration, or discovery, each of these areas has separate review criteria. And we want to look at these review criteria in a little more detail to help authors prepare manuscripts that address these review criteria. So most of our manuscripts are submitted in the area of scholarship of application, and so we are looking at these review criteria: relevance, intended outcomes, context, application design, findings, and conclusion. Okay, notice that we're still having people join in progress, and that's wonderful. For those new people, if they would mute their microphone, then it's not the possibility of being interrupted. So what what do these review criteria mean? So the basic argument in any manuscript submitted for the scholarship of application is that the manuscript presents a relevant instructional approach, course design, laboratory design, so forth, that is effective in supporting student learning. So key issues here are relevance and effectiveness. First, is the instructional approach relevant? So if you want to make your instructional approach relevant or your contribution relevant, it is a good idea to avoid mentioning your institution, your region, your institutional context anywhere in the manuscript except when you're describing how the evidence was obtained. When you put your institution or your region in the title or the abstract or the introduction, you're communicating the idea that your approach only works in your context. And those are not the things that you want to publish. Those are intended for reports at your institution. If you want to make a contribution to the global community, then you want to make sure that you make an argument that your instructional approach is relevant across the globe and not to a particular institutional context. So references to an institution, to a program at that institution, to a region, generally reinforces the idea that your contributions are not relevant except in that context, and you want to avoid those because most of the time that's not the case. Second, is the instructional approach, and this is a mistake in the slide, is the instructional approach effective? And that's where you need compelling evidence to support the idea that your instructional approach is effective, and we'll look at that in a little more detail. Remember the basic argument that it is relevant and effective. Effectiveness is always evaluated with respect to outcomes. It is therefore usually a good idea to make your outcomes explicit. What do you want the students to learn, or what is your application trying to achieve? So your effectiveness is always evaluated with respect to outcomes, and if the outcomes are explicit, then it makes it easier to decide for reviewers to decide whether the manuscript whether the instructional approach presented in the manuscript is effective. So therefore, manuscripts are expected to present clear, explicit statements. If it's a classroom approach, they're expected to be statements of how students would demonstrate the effective learning. What are we looking for? In general, the language is called learning outcomes or learning objectives. So manuscripts are expected to present clear learning outcomes or learning objectives. Next, findings. This is again related to the argument that the approach is effective. So reviewers are looking for compelling evidence supporting assertions of instructional effectiveness. Therefore, and as stated in the aims and scope, if the manuscript only presents student self-report evidence, then these are not considered for peer review. To support the idea that students are learning, a manuscript should provide more than self-report evidence. Self-report evidence is important, such as the students say, I'm learning, or I found the instructional tool effective, or I found the instructional approach effective. That's reasonable evidence, but it's not sufficient. The manuscript is expected to present evidence that goes beyond student self-report. So manuscripts are expected, with respect to evidence, manuscripts are expected to present more than just course grades or exam score. Course grades are not sufficient because they don't show what the students were effective to do. And I tell you that the students all got an average of 78. That sounds good, but we need to know what the 78 is with respect to. So manuscripts are expected to say, here's our problems that the students were given, here are project assignments that the students were given, and here's how the student work was graded with respect to the learning outcome. Generally, course grades or course scores or exam scores alone don't help the reviewers to understand what the students were supposed to do and how well they did with how well they did with achieving those expectations. So generally, the reviewers ask for exam problems or project assignments or quiz problems, and how they did on these particular problems, so reviewers can see how well the students are actually learning the subject being taught. Finally, there are many manuscripts that are submitted that talk about and describe the instructional approach. Manuscripts under the review criterion for application design are expected to explain why the instructional approach was chosen. It's not just enough to describe the instructional approach. There are key design decisions that were made when you came up with the instructional approach or when the author came up with the instructional approach. And these design decisions are expected to be explained. Why did you go this way? So those to review. So these are the basic review criteria for the scholarship of application. And we are looking for relevance and effectiveness. Effectiveness with respect to clear, explicit outcomes. Effectiveness is supported by compelling evidence that goes beyond student self-report, and it goes beyond exam scores. We want to see what the students were expected to do, so exam problems or course assignments, and ways in which those student work was graded. And finally, there should be rationales for the instructional approach. If you're submitting for the scholarship of application, as again, this is the synthesis, and so we need an idea of why the synthesis is needed. Is the plan of work by which you achieve the synthesis clearly laid out? Do you situate the work? I mean, if the manuscript says that a synthesis is needed, it needs to make an argument in terms of the prior work. Is there enough prior work available? Has somebody else submitted published a synthesis of prior work? Then the authors need to make an argument about that their work makes a contribution in the context of prior work. Do they have a methodology for achieving the synthesis? It's not enough to say 10 articles were chosen and we synthesize those. There needs to be some method for how articles are identified, how relevant articles are chosen, what are the criteria for choosing relevant articles, and how was the synthesis done. And then the articles are expected to present synthesis. Finally, the articles are expected to present conclusion. The review criteria for the scholarship of discovery are very similar to the review criteria for the scholarship of integration. Same sort of questions are being asked. Only here, the idea is that instead of a synthesis of existing knowledge, contributions for the scholarship of discovery are making new contributions in terms of knowledge to the field. Two issues that come up repeatedly are questions of plagiarism and editorial reuse. IEEE defines plagiarism as stated here, and that's not a policy of the journal, that's a policy of IEEE publications. And IEEE explicitly does not want plagiarism and has policies in place where actions are taken against authors who plagiarize the work of other authors. In my 5 years as the editor-in-chief for the IEEE Transactions on Education, I have seen on the order of 1,500 to 2,000 articles submitted, and we have only seen 1 or 2 cases of plagiarism. So plagiarism for IEEE Transactions on Education is not a major problem. On the other hand, there's another term that's used, it's called editorial reuse. Sometimes people mistakenly refer to this as self-plagiarism. Self-plagiarism is a contradiction because plagiarism is copying from other authors and claiming it's your own. So you can't plagiarize yourself because plagiarism comes from other authors. Instead, the term is editorial reuse. IEEE Publications also sets forth a policy on editorial reuse, and it recognizes that authors can reuse prior work. For the journal, we have published a policy on educational reuse. And the idea here is to kind of inform authors about the extent to which they can reuse prior work. The basic policy is that the journal does not publish an article where the contribution has been published elsewhere. So if you've made a publication in a conference and you submit a manuscript for the IEEE Transactions on Education, and you say, this manuscript makes more detailed descriptions or more extensive descriptions than were published in the conference paper, that is not a new public contribution. That's just an elaboration of a contribution previously published, and we usually return those to authors without prior review, peer review. So if you have made a conference publication and you want to submit something related to that conference publication, it must be a new and different contribution to be considered for publication. Now, there are no tools existing to look at contributions. Instead, IEEE Publications uses a tool referred to as either cross-check or authenticate. This is a tool that uses content overlap. So it can only look at portions of your manuscript and check those portions of the manuscript via an enormous database of prior published work, in which case it'll flag things which says this section of text was published elsewhere. That doesn't mean that it's a problem, it just means that there's some content overlap. So then this is put into an originality report, and I, as the editor-in-chief, review the originality report, and based on the extent of the content overlap and the sources of content overlap, make an editorial decision about whether there's a problem with respect to either plagiarism or editorial reuse. If there are problems, then that information is returned to the author. In any email to the authors, I make it a policy to include the report from cross-check or authenticate report, referred to as the originality report, so that authors can see where content overlap is being flagged. Another issue that is relatively new is within the past year, the journal has adopted a policy that requires that abstracts be published as structured abstracts. So all of the articles that are published in or after the May 2018 issue will have a structured abstract. Now, in order to make it into the May 18th issue, the manuscript had to be ready for publication by December. So basically, any manuscript that is submitted now or afterwards is expected to have a structured abstract. If a manuscript does not have a structured abstract, it is not sent out for peer review. Instead, it is returned to the author, and the author is asked to prepare a structured abstract. A structured abstract is nothing more than an abstract with designated sections. For the IEEE Transactions on Education, structured abstract has these sections, and the sections are described in this document, which is published on the author's resources site. So we look at that, we look at the abstract. If it does not have these sections and the manuscript is considered going out for peer review, we return the manuscript to the author and ask for a structured abstract. These The sections for the structured abstract are laid out into the document referred to as priorly, referred to on the prior slide. I would say that in the 6 months or so that the policy has been in place, there have been a number of problems where authors are having trouble articulating the contributions of their manuscript. So to help the authors, the contribution section should refer to how the literature on education within a field, within the scope of interest of the IEEE, is different after the possible publication of their manuscript. That is, what difference is it being made to the literature on the field? If you describe and say, this is what the manuscript presents, that is not a contribution, it's a description of what will be presented in the manuscript. Instead, this section is looking for contributions. What's different about the literature? What do we know now that we didn't know before the manuscript was published? Those are kinds of things that we are looking for in the contribution section. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to look for a moment and see if there are any questions being published in the chat section. There are no questions. Whoops. There are no questions in the chat room. So we're currently going to pause and see if there are any questions because we ran through that material pretty quickly to make sure that we finished within the time limit and had time to answer questions. So I'm going to wait and see if we get any questions with respect to should we go through something in a little more detail, should we go through something in a little more elaboration. So I'm very interested in terms of how you looked at the presentation and the questions that you would like to have answered and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Okay. Peter, who's the editor for the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technologies, asked the question, how would you know whether to submit a manuscript to the IEEE Transactions on Education or the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technology? Okay. So I'm going to do Peter's work for him somewhat. The IEEE Transactions on Learning Technologies focus contributions on learning technology. So if you have an instructional technology that you think makes a difference in student learning, pretty much regardless of field, so it's relatively independent of field, learning technologies would be the appropriate place. So if your contribution is focused on learning technologies, not education in a field of interest to the IEEE, it would go to the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technology. On the other hand, if your contribution is to education, say I've got something that helps students learn control systems, or I have something that helps students learn electronics, that would be a contribution to the IEEE, that would be a contribution to education and appropriate for the IEEE Transactions on Education. So is it learning technologies that you're after or education? Learning technologies goes to the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technology. If it's a contribution to education in a field of which IEEE is interested, then it would go to the IEEE Transactions on Learning Technology. Somebody asked a question, Mark Carnes, excuse me if I got the name wrong, asked a question on reuse of dissertations. This is a little trickier because dissertations are now becoming more accessible, but if the overlap is with a dissertation, that is considered acceptable editorial reuse because the dissertation is still in that kind of flux area, whether it's actually a published contribution to the field. And so if you're reusing material from the dissertation, that is okay. You just have to make clear that what the relationship between the manuscript being submitted and the dissertation is. So if there's reuse involved and it's identified, that the cover letter should state the relationship between the manuscript and the dissertation. Third question, what are the criteria to use if a paper is more appropriate for an education society conference or the transaction? That's a question of, partly, it's a question of several things. One is the maturity of contribution. If the contribution has gone through several iterations, the author is thinking about things, they've got an idea, and they've tried it out, and they have evidence that is compelling to support it, I would say they want to make a contribution to the transactions. That is, in general, archival publications count for the author more than a conference publication. And so if the author wants to make a journal publication and they want it to count as a journal publication, then they need to make sure that their contribution has been tested. They have gone through the process of thinking about what are my intended outcomes, how is my instructional approach being supported by the literature, and do I have compelling evidence? If any one of those three is not present and the author wants to sort of try out the ideas, get their reactions from peers, make a contribution in progress or whatever, and they have a sufficient contribution, they should consider an educational society conference. So if any of the answers to those three questions need some clarification, please let me know.
Thank you, Jeff, for your brilliant presentation, your answers to the question asked, and thanks for contributing again to the Society with this webinar. This seminar has been recorded and will be published soon on our who watch this video. Just a reminder about the next webinar. This will be on April 4th, and our guest will be Sorel Risman to talk about the possibilities of participation offered by Merlot Open Repository as an international gateway for finding OER. Thank you, and see you next time.